Story number 1. The Woman on the Tier. You're locked in a concrete cell, alone with 4 walls and a silence that screams. Your towel, hung carefully on the bunk, is on the floor again, thrown with purpose. Something's here, and it's not just you. I spent some time in the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center, and for a while I was in solitary confinement. Every night, you dream of her, a woman in an old prison uniform, smiling as she steps off the edge. A sheet around her neck, just me, 4 walls, and too much time to think. Her joy chills you, like she's free and you're the one trapped. My cell had bunk beds. Though I was the only one there, you wake, heart pounding, certain she's watching from the bunk above. I'd hang my towel from the top bunk after showers, always in the same spot. The cell feels alive, and you're not sure you're alone, but it never stayed there. You secure the towel, clipping it tight, but it lands on the same spot, as if flung, almost every day. Without fail, I'd turn around and find it on the floor. You try to explain it, drafts, vibrations, but it's too deliberate. It didn't fall like it slipped. The cell is a cage, your thoughts spiraling in the endless quiet. It felt like something threw it. You start to dread the dark, the bunk above a looming presence. Even when I made sure it was secure, I clipped it over the rail and it would end up in the exact same spot on the concrete. You shake it off, blaming the isolation. At first, I chalked it up to the ventilation or maybe the vibration from the heavy cell doors slamming down the block, but it didn't feel like that. Then the dreams come, and they're not just dreams. It felt deliberate. She's there every night, barefoot, in a faded uniform, standing on the upper tier. The dreams started not long after. Her smile is warm, but her eyes are wrong. Bright, too bright, as she ties the sheet and leaps. I'd see a woman barefoot wearing an old car uniform we didn't use anymore, standing on the upper tier of the block. She's not falling, she's soaring, joyful. In the dreams, she would smile at me like we were old friends. You wake, soaked in sweat, checking the bunk above, empty but heavy with her presence. And then she'd step off the edge with a sheet tied around her neck every time you stopped sleeping, afraid to see her again. But the strange part, she wasn't sad. The cell is shrinking, and her shadow is growing. She always looked joyful, like she was finally free, like she was flying. You're losing track of time, reality blurring. I started to dread sleeping. The towel falls daily, always in that spot, mocking you. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, certain that if I opened my eyes fast enough, I'd catch someone watching me from the bunk above. You question your mind. Solitary does that. Twists your thoughts. It messed with me being alone in that tiny cell, day in and day out. But this feels real, too real. In solitary, you lose your grip on time. You start talking to the walls, half expecting her to answer. Your thoughts loop. You're not crazy, but you're not alone either. Reality warps. Back in general population, you confide in another inmate. You start questioning everything. Her face changes when you mention the towel, the dreams, what's real, what's not. She knows something, and it's not just rumors. Whether your own brain is turning against you, she tells you about a woman years ago who took her life on that tier. It wasn't until I moved back into the general population that I told one of the other women about the dreams and the towel thing. Your blood runs cold. You never mentioned the hanging or where she stood. She looked at me kind of sideways and then said, "You didn't know? She was real. And she was there with you." "Yeah, someone did hang herself in the block a few years ago from the top tier. You never believed in ghosts, but this is different." My stomach dropped. The towel, the dreams, her smile. They weren't your mind-breaking. I hadn't told her about the hanging dream. They were hers, her story, her escape. I hadn't said where I saw the woman step off. "You're free now." But she's not. I didn't know what to believe now. You carry her with you, a weight in the quiet. I've never been someone into the paranormal. You wonder if she's still there, waiting for someone else to see her. I always figured solitary just plays tricks on you. You're out of Pocatella, but the cell follows you. But there's a difference between hallucinations and a shared truth. You avoid tight spaces, places that feel too still. And now, years later, I wonder, was I alone in that cell? Or was she still there trying to show me how she made her escape of sorts? You told a friend, expecting skepticism, but she nodded, sharing a story from another prison, objects moving, faces in dreams. You searched online, finding whispers of Pocatella's history. A 1990s article mentioned a suicide, a woman in that block, her name lost to time. The details matched, same tear, same joy in her final act. You contacted a former guard, now retired. She was cagey, admitting only that the block was unlucky. Inmates complained of cold spots, things falling, but the staff dismissed it. You pushed, but she hung up, unwilling to say more. You found a forum for ex-inmates, their stories echoing yours, towels on the floor, shadows on the tier. One woman claimed she saw her too, smiling, stepping off. Years later, you're different, haunted, but grounded. You work a desk job, live in a bright apartment, but you check corners, avoid bunks. The dreams are rarer, but her face lingers, joyful and free. You've written about it, shared it anonymously online. Others respond, their own ghosts trailing them. You don't know if she was trapped or just passing through, but you know she was real, and you hope she's found her peace, even if you haven't. Story number 2, The Price of a Chip Bag. The jail cell was a cage of flickering lights and heavy air, where trust was a luxury no one could afford. My friend, a man who'd never hurt a soul, found himself trapped in that concrete hell, his life unraveled by bad luck. A bag of chips, such a small thing, lit the spark that turned a quiet night into a bloodbath. He was no criminal, just a father caught in a system that didn't care. This is the story of how a trivial theft became a murder, and the horror that lingers in his nightmares. The county jail was a world apart, its walls alive with tension. Every sound, the clank of bars, the shuffle of feet, carried a threat. My friend lay on his bunk, a stranger to this place, watching shadows dance under the relentless fluorescent glow. His cellmates were ticking bombs, one restless, one silent, both dangerous in their own way. A single accusation, a missing snack, set the stage for violence. It was a spark so small, yet it burned everything down. A friend of mine, one of the most genuine, hard-working guys I've ever known, told me this story. He was a good man, broken by a divorce and job loss. He went through a rough divorce. He fought to support his daughter, working overtime until the company he worked for, a mid-sized manufacturing one, began having financial issues. They cut him loose, And just like that, he was let go. Jail followed when he couldn't pay child support. He was behind bars for failing behind on child support. The cell was a pressure cooker, shared with two men who carried their own demons. He was assigned to a 3-man cell with 2 other guys, both repeat offenders. Ricky was jittery, always moving. Marcus was quiet, his eyes cold. One of them was twitchy. The other one was quiet and more measured. A fight brewed over a bag of chips. Ricky accused the quiet one, Marcus, of stealing a bag of chips. Marcus denied it. Marcus, of course, denied it, saying he hadn't touched them. The argument fizzled, but the air stayed thick. They went back and forth for a few minutes. My friend stayed out of it, silent on his bunk. My friend just stayed on his bunk trying to disappear. They slept or pretended to. Then a scraping sound shattered the night. My friend was yanked awake by a strange scraping sound. Ricky loomed over Marcus, a metal pipe in the hand. Ricky standing over Marcus's bunk with something long and shiny in his hands. Shbooks. The attack was merciless, deliberate. Ricky brought it down again and again. Blood painted the cell. The blows relentless. Blood sprayed the walls, soaked the sheets, and pulled onto the floors. My friend froze, trapped. My friend was paralyzed. The sound was worse than the sight, a wet, hollow thud like fruit crushed under cloth, the sound of the impact like a watermelon wrapped in wet towel. Marcus lay still, unrecognizable. Marcus stopped moving, just slumped there, his face unrecognizable. Ricky stood, panting, the pipe clattering to the floor. Ricky backed away slyly, panting, his hands and arms slick with blood. Guards stormed in, late and stunned. The guards came eventually. Chaos erupted, sirens, shouts, cuffs. They yanked my friend out, cuffed him. Even though he hadn't moved from his bed, the chips were found, untouched, in Ricky's mattress. They found the chips unopened, still in Ricky's mattress. My friend walked free, but the blood stayed with him. He still has the nightmares. The prison was a powder keg, and a chip bag was the match. The worst part wasn't just the brutality. It was how easily it happened. One small spark, and a man was gone. A bag of chips, a moment of paranoia, and then a man was dead. The cell's walls still echo in his mind, a reminder of how fragile safety is. That story stuck with me. Story number 3, The Haunting Shadow. The prison was a tomb at night, its concrete walls swallowing every sound but our breaths. I lay on my bunk, eyes fixed on the ceiling, when a chill slithered down my spine. Something was here, moving in the dark, its presence heavy, like a hand pressing on my chest. I didn't dare look, but I knew it was watching. A sound broke the silence. A door in the bathroom, swinging on its hinges, slow and deliberate. No one was there. No one ever was. But the air shifted, colder, thicker, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The others stirred in their bunks, their whispers sharp with fear. I'd heard the stories whispered in the yard about the kid who died here, who'd found a way to escape the bars but not the pain. They said he never left, that his shadow lingered, restless, angry. I didn't believe it at first, but now, in the dead of night, I felt it, a weight, a gaze, a thing that didn't belong. The shadow moved, or so it seemed. A flicker in the corner of my eye, too quick to catch. My heart pounded loud enough to drown out the hum of the fluorescent lights. I wanted to call out, to wake the others, but my voice was gone, stolen by the thing that roamed the dorm, its presence a blade against my skin. This wasn't just a prison, it was a cage for something else, something that didn't sleep, didn't die. We were all trapped with it, inmates and guards alike, and no one spoke its name. But we felt it every night, waiting for one of us to look too long, to see too much. I spent a year in a New York prison, medium security dorm. The place was old, its walls stained with decades of despair, its air thick with the ghosts of men who'd never left. The kid had apparently found a way to hang himself in the bathroom at some point in the past. The story was a legend among the inmates, passed down like a warning. Don't linger in the bathroom. Don't look too long in the mirrors. I swear to Christ, we would all jump out of our bunks when someone would slam this one particular stall door in the middle of the night. It happened too often, always the same door, always empty when we checked. Even the corrections officer would run in and look. There'd be no one there but a swinging stall door. The first time it happened, I thought it was a prank, some inmate messing with us. But the fear in the others' eyes had told me different. They'd seen it too, felt it, a presence that didn't belong, that moved through the dorm like smoke. I and some of the other inmates believed it was the same being, but there was a shadow that would roam through the whole dorm, and you could strongly sense it, a hair-raising feel. It wasn't just a story to pass the time, it was real. A chill that settled in your bones, a weight that woke you in the night. One night, I couldn't sleep, the air too heavy, the silence too loud. One night, I woke up feeling like it was around. My bunk was in the corner, a thin divider separating me from the open dorm. I lay still, my breath shallow, listening for something I didn't want to hear. Then I felt it, eyes on me, not human, not alive. I peeked over the divider to see it slowly hovering around, a shape darker than the shadows, formless but deliberate, gliding past the bunks. My skin crawled, every hair standing on end. I held my breath, afraid to move, afraid to blink. The shadow paused, as if it knew I was watching, its presence a pressure in my chest. I wasn't alone seeing it. Someone else was awake, someone who shouldn't have been, and their gaze was locked on the same nightmare. I glanced toward the guard station where the corrections officer sat, his desk lit by a dim lamp. I peeked over at the corrections officer, and his gaze was fixed on this thing. His face was pale, his eyes wide, unblinking, like he was caught in a spell. It was like he was shocked, but in a trance watching it. I wanted to call out, to break the spell, but my voice was gone, my throat tight. The shadow moved again, drifting toward the bathroom, and the officer didn't follow, didn't move, just stared until it was gone. I never did ask him about it. Yeah, I didn't need to. The look on his face said enough. He'd seen it, felt it, just like us. The next day, he was quieter, his usual bark replaced by a nervous edge. We didn't talk about it, not with him, not with each other. Some things you don't say aloud, not in a place like this, where the walls listen and the shadows wait. The shadow came back night after night, sometimes silent, sometimes with that door swinging, a reminder of the kid who'd left his mark. We learned to live with it, to keep our heads down, to pray it passed us by, but it never left, not really. It was part of the dorm, woven into the concrete, the bars, the bunks. I served my time, walked out into the sun, But that shadow stayed with me, a chill I couldn't shake, a memory of eyes that weren't there, watching from the dark. Story number 4, The Harbinger Cat. My wife used to work in nursing homes. Those places were a world unto themselves, where life and death danced in the flicker of fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and whispers of the inevitable. Just as crazy stuff happened in those places. 2. Stories of ghostly footsteps and flickering TVs were common, but nothing was as unsettling as the cat. It wasn't just an animal, it was a messenger, a shadow that carried death in its paws. They had a death cat. Its presence turned the home into a place of omens, where every glance from its golden eyes felt like a verdict. The cat was a mystery, a creature of instinct and dread. It was a rescue cat from a local shelter that was brought in as a sort of therapy thing for residents. They called it Whisper, a cruel irony for a beast that spoke only through silence. Its fur was a patchwork of black and gray, its movements slow and deliberate, like it knew secrets the rest of us couldn't bear. Well, the cat didn't want to be bothered unless you're about to die. It shunned affection, slipping away from eager hands, preferring the corners of rooms where the light didn't reach. But when it chose you, when it curled up at your bedside, it was a sentence, not a comfort. Whisper was never wrong. If that cat was seen actually sitting within/near a certain resident, there was a 99% chance that person would die 24 hours later. Nurses whispered about it, their voices trembling, as if saying its name might summon its gaze. And the cat was never wrong. It didn't matter if the resident was frail or fighting fit. Whisper's presence was a clock, ticking down to the end. The staff learned to watch it, to dread its slow walk down the halls, its tail a metronome of fate. Once, it sat by Mrs. Clara, a woman who laughed off the rumors. By morning, she was gone, her smile frozen, the cat already stalking its next mark. The home lived in its shadow. Residents began to fear Whisper, their eyes darting to the doorways, praying it wouldn't enter. Some begged the staff to keep it away, as if barring the cat could bar death itself. But Whisper was relentless, slipping through locked doors, its paws slant on the linoleum. My wife told me how it would appear without warning, its eyes glowing in the dim light of a patient's room. One night, it perched on Mr. Ellis's bed, its stare unblinking as he gasped his last. The staff didn't speak of it to outsiders, but the truth hung heavy. Whisper wasn't just predicting death, it was heralding it. A reaper in feline form. The cat's power grew into legend. Doctors scoffed, calling it coincidence. But the nurses knew better. They'd seen it too many times. Whisper's vigil, the quiet that followed, the empty bed by dawn. One nurse swore she saw it pause outside a room, then turn away, as if sparing the occupant for another day. My wife said the cat seemed to choose, its decisions final, its purpose unknowable. When it sat by young Mr. Thompson, a man recovering from surgery, the staff held their breath. He was dead by noon, his heart failing without warning. Whisper had already moved on, its tail vanishing around a corner, seeking the next soul. The home was never the same. Whisper wasn't just a cat, it was a force, a reminder that death walked among them, patient and precise. My wife left the job, unable to bear the weight of its gaze, the way it seemed to know her, too. Even now, she dreams of it, its eyes burning in the dark. Watching her from the foot of the bed, the nursing home still stands, and whisper, if it's still alive, still roams its halls. Don't visit that place. Don't meet its gaze. Some say it's just a cat, but those who've seen it know the truth. Whisper doesn't just predict death, it calls it, and it never misses. Story number 5. The Blade of the Broken. The cell block was a cage for broken souls, and I was one of them. My name's Danny, a kid trapped in a California juvie where hope rotted faster than the walls. I was locked up in juvenile detention. The air was thick with despair. Every breath a reminder of what we'd lost. The place was horrible. But it wasn't the guards or the bars that scared me. It was the eyes of the kids, empty yet sharp, like they'd seen too much. You could practically taste the hopelessness in the air. And in that hell, one boy stood out, a ghost among monsters. His silence screamed louder than any fight. There was this one kid, we called him Mouse. He was a wisp of a boy, barely there. His skin pale as the moon. He was pale, rail-thin, and hardly said anything ever. His eyes held a storm, a quiet rage that flickered in the shadows. He always had a haunted look in his eyes. I wondered what had carved that look into him. What demons he carried, like he'd already been through hell before he even got locked up. He was a target, and the wolves circled. The predator wore a cruel grin, and then there was Terry. He was a beast, all muscle and venom, his laughter a blade in the yard. He was built like a linebacker and mean as a snake. He ruled the block with fists and fear. He picked on Mouse from day one, constantly bullying him. Mouse was his prey, and Terry savored the hunt. Verbal abuse, shoving him around in the yard, cornering him in the showers. We all saw it, but no one spoke. Survival meant looking away. The cruelty was a poison, seeping into Mouse's bones. Mouse's backside was taking a battering. His body shrank, his spirit dimmed. We all saw the way Mouse started shrinking into himself. He was a shadow, fading under Terry's weight. He barely slept, flinched whenever someone got too close and stopped eating. But something shifted in him, a spark in the dark. For weeks, you could feel the tension building. His movements grew deliberate, his gaze sharp with intent, like a storm behind Mouse's eyes. That night, the world turned red on one quiet, unsuspecting night. It happened. The block was still, the air heavy with unspoken dread. The unit was quiet. I was drifting, half lost in dreams, when a sound jolted me awake. I heard a strange shuffle, and then a hard crack, and then screaming. The scream wasn't human, it was raw, primal. I sat up, and I saw something I'll never forget. Mouse was a specter, his thin frame a weapon. Mouse had Terry on the floor straddling his chest. The act was surgical, a nightmare carved in blood. There was a piece of metal in his hand. It gleamed, too perfect for this place, a gift from some dark angel. Terry's face was already covered in blood. Mouse had struck with precision, a predator reborn. Mouse had hit him hard from behind, then with terrifying calmness, took the blade and went for his eyes. He didn't flinch, his hands steady as he carved. He didn't just slash, he removed them. The horror was absolute. One popped out and rolled over the floor. It glistened, a grotesque relic in the dim light. Then he went for the torso, slashed his stomach open. The smell hit like a wave, copper and rot. The smell of blood hit as guts spilled out onto the floor. The floor drank it, dark and greedy. Blood pulled fast, soaking into the cracks on the floor. Mouse was a machine, no emotion, only purpose. Mouse moved with speed and precision. The guards came too late. By the time the guards swarmed in, it was too late. Terry was gone, his body a ruin. They pulled Mouse off the body, but Terry was already gone. The block erupted. Some retched, others wept. Some of the kids were puking, others were crying. I couldn't move. My eyes locked on the scene. You never forget seeing something like that. Mouse was a paradox, a broken boy turned executioner. Mouse was hauled off to Kike the next day. The aftermath was a whisper, a legend born in blood. Word was he was committed to long term. Mouse vanished, but his shadow lingered. We never saw him again. Years later, I heard a rumor that shook me. Someone I knew looked him up. Mouse had walked free, remade himself. Turns out Mouse got out, cleaned up, and put himself through school and became a lawyer. The boy who'd gutted Terry was now a man in a suit. It was definitely him. The truth was a weight I couldn't shake. That fact still rattles around in my head. How does a kid like that become a savior of justice? I scoured X for stories, finding tales of others like him, kids who broke, then built themselves anew. But none matched Mouse's cold precision, his silent fury. I see him in my dreams, that blade in his hand, those eyes unyielding. Some scars don't fade, they just sharpen. And Mouse's story is one I'll carry forever. Story number 6, The Child in the Ward. The hospital was a fortress of routine, its sterile halls a bulwark against chaos. I'm sharing this story from a hospital prison wing. In the small-town county hospital where I worked, the air was thick with the weight of lives in limbo. The hospital isn't that old. Built in the 70s, and it's a small-town county hospital. Its walls, though dated, held stories that clung like damp rot. We don't take trauma cases, and my man does. Our role was to stabilize, to hold the line until patients, often prisoners, could be moved to larger facilities. It's only to stabilize them until Life-A-Light or EMS can transfer them to another facility. The prison wing was a world apart, a place where hope flickered dimly. There are 2 special rooms I want to talk about. Room 123 and 234. They share a wall. These rooms were unremarkable on paper, but they pulsed with something unspoken. Deaths in the room are usually older people and natural causes. The elderly passed quietly, their final breaths blending into the hum of machines. The prison wing has been rolling for 8 years or so, and the prisoners who've come in, if they die, it's natural causes. But there was an undercurrent, a shadow that lingered. But this one room set, it's just weird. The whispers began softly, like a draft through a cracked window. I'm agnostic atheist, but I can't deny the same thing keeps happening in room 123 and especially 234. I prided myself on logic, but the patterns defied reason. There have been several times right before they pass the inmate talks about a kid in the room, but it's the ones who are delirious before death. Their voices, frail and fading, spoke of a child small, silent, watching. Some saw it sitting at the foot of their bed. Others felt it brush past in the dark. Also, there have been several mentally altered offenders, not drug adult, but actual mental status, who have talked about or completely lost their mind over the kid that was under their bed or running around and messing with them. The stories were consistent, too vivid to dismiss. They described a boy no older than 10, with pale skin and eyes that didn't blink. One guy became so violent, we had to discharge him from the hospital and back to his unit. His screams echoed down the hall, a primal fear that shook even the guards. He'd torn at his restraints, claiming the child was pulling at his sheets, whispering his name. Occasionally, an inmate with a full mental capacity will mention the TV in another room was so loud he could hear it. The sound was always the same, a cheerful jingle, like a children's show cutting through the ward's silence. Said it sounded like a kid show. I checked again and again, but the TVs were off, the room's empty. I kept my hallway quiet and made sure I couldn't hear the TV in the hall. The ward was a tomb at night, its silence absolute. Yet the complaints persisted, from men who shouldn't have known each other's stories. There's certainly arguments that can be made that the word of mouth got back to the unit about the kid's story, but neither officers nor nurses made a habit of telling the stories to inmates. We were professionals, tight-lipped, yet the tales spread like wildfire. Besides, we admit offenders from dozens of units, so it's always creeped us out a bit. The ward began to feel alive, its walls watching. I started noticing things, flickering lights into a cold spot near the shared wall. One night, I found a child's drawing in 123, a crude sketch of a boy holding a balloon tucked under a bed. No one claimed it, and the inmate swore he'd never seen it before. I burned it in the break room sink, but the image stayed with me, etched into my nightmares. On X, I found posts from former nurses, whispers of a child who haunted the wing, tied to a tragedy no one could confirm. The hospital records were clean, but the stories weren't. Tales of a boy who died in the 7th Uist, left behind in the ward's early days. I fortified my routine, checking rooms twice, but the child in the ward lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake, watching from the edges of reason. Story number 7, The Shadows of Cell Block 13. The prison's walls breathe violence, soaked in decades of rage and despair. The California sun beats down, but inside Cell Block 13, the air is cold, heavy with something older than the concrete. I am a retired corrections officer for over 20 years. 20 years of walking these halls, and the ghosts were as real as the inmates. The prison I worked at was made in the 80s, aka the gladiator days, and I had a lot of experiences over the years, to the point that they just became part of the job. But they never stopped scaring me. The shadows move when you're not looking. Full shadow apparitions, voices, objects moving on their own, video footage, cold blasts of air in no AC areas on hot nights, doors unlocking, footsteps. They weren't tricks of the mind. The smells really freaked me out. The smell of strong sweat in areas where no inmates were at. It lingered in empty cells, sharp and human, where no one had been for hours. I believe prisons are a hotbed for the paranormal due to the violence, suicide, anger, and mental health that the environment absorbs into it. This place was alive with something else. Cell Block 13 was the worst. The mental health unit, converted from an old gym, felt like a cage for more than just inmates. We had a mental health building that was converted from a gym. The air was thick, oppressive, like it was pushing back. Some offices were built inside the building like boxes stacked together. Every night, we checked for stragglers. Officers would do a security check to make sure no inmates were left to verify with our count lock. But something was always there, waiting. A doctor came to the front entrance asking why he had an inmate still sitting down in his office. He wasn't an inmate. We told him that there should not be any in the back. The doctor's face drained of color. Another staff member said they saw him all. We checked, hearts pounding. So when they went to check it out, it was very odd because they found nothing. The office was empty, the chair still warm. They told the doctor, and he went all white-faced. He quit a week later, shaken. I had never seen it happen so visually. It wasn't human. The shadows had intent. We would move chairs with rollers into the hallway and come back later, and they would be further down. It wasn't a prank. It was kind of fun, really, until it wasn't. I really only saw a few doors open on their own as I walked up to go through them. They swung wide, deliberate, like an invitation. Some shadows would be distinct, like a figure, like some were blobs, clouds that you couldn't see through. They hovered near certain cells, unmoving, watching. I thought they were like flying insects around certain lights casting shadows. But the blob would be consistent throughout the same shape. Some shadows were worse. Some shadows would give a very negative vibe when seen. They pressed against your chest, made your breath catch. I still hold my breath when I walk into a dark room or area. Years later, I found a notebook in an abandoned cell, pages brittle, ink faded to... I keep expecting to see him in the corner of the room, the shadow that haunts the dark. It was a prisoner's journal, scrawled with warnings. The shadow takes what it wants. I'll never forget that fear. It was primal, deep towards it, surreal. It named something that wasn't human, something that fed on the prison's pain. I retired 6 years ago, but Cell Block 13 never left me. It's been over 6 years since I've worked behind the walls of the California State Prison. The shadows followed me home. Every time I get the tingle, it's like I'm still there, sweating, fearing, and concerned about walking through the area of the prison where I experienced these hauntings. The notebook mentioned a guard who vanished in the 80s, last seen in the mental health unit. Was he taken? I don't walk into dark rooms anymore. The shadows are still there, waiting, and they know my name. Story number 8, The Whistling Ghost of the Reformatory. The Ohio State Reformatory loomed like a forgotten god, its walls radiating a cold that sank into your soul. I've done a fair number of paranormal investigations, old hospitals, abandoned schools, backward cemeteries, but none of them have ever gotten under my skin like the Ohio State Reformatory. I'd faced shadows before, but this place was different. Its darkness wasn't empty, it was alive, watching, waiting. I stepped inside, and the air tightened around me like a noose. We sat in the chapel, our voices soft, asking questions into the void. We did an EVP session in the chapel, just me and my friend sitting quietly asking questions in the dark. Nothing answered, or so we thought. Later, the recording revealed a whistle clear and haunting, like a janitor strolling through the night. You could hear something clear as day, someone whistling, not random, a tune. It was there, close, and we'd been deaf to it. The cell block stretched into infinity, a maze of steel and sorrow. Then there were the ranges, long echoing rows of cells stacked on top of each other like a steel hive. Each step echoed, but it wasn't the sound that stopped me. It was the eyes. I had this overwhelming sense that I was being watched, not by one thing, but dozens. They were behind every door, unseen but undeniable, boring into me. I wasn't alone, and they knew it. My skin prickled, a sensation too real to dismiss. I covered my hair under my hoodie because of the feeling of being touched was too intense to ignore. Something brushed against me, not a breeze, but a deliberate caress from the dark. I froze, my flashlight shaking, the beam catching nothing but peeling paint. Whatever was in that prison didn't just watch. It reached out, claiming you as its own. The reformatory wasn't just haunted, it was angry. Something about the place was different. It didn't want us there. The air grew heavier, the shadows sharper, like the building itself was pushing us out. This wasn't a residual echo of the past. It was aware, hostile, alive. I fled, knowing it could follow me, and it has, in every quiet moment since. The Ohio State Reformatory was a beast of stone and steel, its Gothic spires clawing at the sky. The building itself is intimidating, part Gothic cathedral, part nightmare. I'd hunted ghosts in crumbling asylums and forgotten graves, but this place was a league of its own. Massive cell block towers like steel skeletons. The walls bled rust, the paint flaking like dead skin. Paint peels from the walls like old skin. The cold wasn't just weather, it was a presence, seeping into your bones. And the cold really gets in your bones. Our first visit was a lockdown. No lights, just flashlights and recorders. We moved through the chapel, its pews warped by time, and set up for an EVP session. Is anyone here? Do you want to say something? Standard stuff. The silence was absolute. Our questions hanging unanswered. No noise, no voices, just cold silence. We left disappointed, thinking the night was a bust, but the recording told a different story. None of us had heard it in the moment, but it was there, and it was close. The whistling wasn't just sound, it was a message. A casual taunt from something we couldn't see. It echoed like footsteps in an empty hall, deliberate and carefree. We replayed it, hearts pounding, trying to match it to any tune we knew. But it was unique, a signature from the beyond. The chapel had been alive, and we'd been too blind to notice. That was our first warning. But the reformatory had more to show us. The cell blocks were a labyrinth of despair, each tier a monument to suffering. Walking those tiers at night, even with a flashlight, is harrowing. The darkness wasn't just absence of light. It was thick, tangible, pressing against you. It's not just it's dark. It's the feeling you're walking into a space that once held hundreds of men, violent, angry, broken men. I felt them, their rage and pain soaked into the walls. It's like that energy has soaked into the concrete. I stopped, my chest constricting, a wave of dread washing over me. I remember walking along one range and stopping dead in my tracks. My chest tightened. It wasn't just one gaze, it was a chorus. a multitude of unseen eyes tracking my every step, like there were eyes behind every single cell door staring at me. I pulled my hoodie tighter, shielding myself from the sensation of fingers brushing my neck. The reformatory wasn't just haunted, it was a predator, and I was its prey. Our second visit was worse. The reformatory's hostility, unmistakable. I went twice. That was enough. The air was denser, like breathing through a wet cloth. The second time we stepped inside, the air had weight to it, oppressive. We tried another EVP session, but the chapel felt different. Its silence not empty, but threatening. We moved to the ranges, hoping for evidence. But the prison had other plans. It didn't want us there, and it made it clear. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more aggressive. Each cell door seemed to pulse with intent, the shadows within shifting just beyond my flashlight's reach. I felt a touch, not a breeze, but a cold, deliberate pressure on my shoulder. I spun around, finding nothing but darkness. Yet the sensation lingered, a violation I couldn't shake. The reformatory wasn't playing, it was warning us to leave. I lasted only a few hours before I broke. I only made it a few hours. I tapped out. The energy wasn't residual, a mere echo of the past. And unlike other locations where the energy feels residual, like a recording on loop, this felt aware, hostile. It was alive, aware, and it didn't want us probing its secrets. Like it could follow you home. I fled, my friend close behind, the reformatory's weight lifting only when we crossed its threshold. I haven't returned, and I won't. I haven't gone back since, and honestly don't plan to. Other haunted places fade with time, their scares softening into stories. There are haunted places, and then there's the Ohio State Reformatory. But this place clings to you, its cold fingers wrapped around your thoughts. That place doesn't just scare you, it stays with you. The whistling, the eyes, the touch, they're with me still, in every dark corner, every quiet night. The reformatory isn't just a building, it's a memory that hunts you. Story number 9, The Whispers in the Box. The cell wasn't just a cage, it was alive. In the heart of Lake Butler Correctional, a sprawling prison in Central Florida, Ethan, barely 18, found himself locked in a world of steel and shadows. Every bar, every wall seemed to pulse with secrets older than the inmates. At 18 years old, I was arrested for armed burglary. His crime landed him 2 years in a place where hope was a rare commodity. This landed me 2 years in the Florida Department of Corrections. But nothing could prepare him for the whispers that hunted him in the dark. One was the whispers. The prison's heart was the honeycomb, a fortress of cinder blocks stacked like a giant hive. Upon arriving, we were placed in a building known as the Honeycomb, a giant structure in the center of the prison that's covered in cinder blocks facing sideways, making it look like a giant bee's nest. Ethan shared a 2-man cell, its bars cold and unyielding. We were assigned to 2-man cells, classic bars and correctional officers patrolling. Stories swirled among the inmates, tales of crooked guards, past crimes, and ghosts that roamed the halls. As anyone who's done time will tell you, everyone has a story to tell. The whispers in the box were the most chilling, a legend that clung to the disciplinary dorm like damp rot. The story goes that in the disciplinary dorm, aka the box, A spirit will torment inmates at night, whispering to them as they sleep. No one Ethan knew had faced the box, a place reserved for the worst offenders. No one I spoke to had ever been in the box at Lake Butler. Most inmates moved on quickly, but Ethan's luck ran dry. Most inmates had never been there, as most people in the honeycomb were usually transferred to the main prison in a week or two. A fight with 2 gang members over protection money landed him in trouble. I had gotten into a fight with 2 gangsters who were trying to collect protection money from non-gang members such as myself. The guards broke it up, and Ethan was sentenced to 2 weeks in solitary. I was given 2 weeks solitary confinement. He thought it would be easy, a quiet escape from the chaos. Now, 2 weeks alone, no prices. Trying to take your food or act tough sounded easy. He was wrong, terribly wrong. I still shudder thinking about how wrong I was. The first few days were routine: exercise, meals, reading, sleep. The first 3 days went without incident. Ethan settled into a rhythm, confident he could endure. This was my decided routine that would get me through the next 2 weeks. But the box had other plans, and its whispers were waiting. It was then I heard the whispers. They came on the 3rd night, soft and insidious, like a blade grazing skin. They weren't coming from the door, but behind me. The sound wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient. I turned, seeing no one in the pale moonlight coming through the 412 window at the top of my cell. Ethan dismissed it as solitude playing tricks. Clearly, the solitude was getting to me, I thought as I shuffled back to my bunk. He'd scoffed at ghost stories before. I'd heard stories, but never believed any ghosts. Demons, angels, and all of that just sounded like ridiculous kid stuff to me. But the air grew heavy, and the cell felt crowded. As I laid in my bunk, I couldn't help but shake the feeling that I was being watched. The presence was undeniable, a weight pressing on Ethan's chest. Not an uncommon feeling, really. There were cameras everywhere, officers doing regular checks, but this felt like someone was in the room with me. The cell was bare, nowhere to hide. Not like they had anywhere to hide. I just had a toilet sink combo. My desk bolted to the wall with a concrete pillar for a stool and a bunk. He scanned every corner, finding nothing. A quick scan was all I needed to see. I was alone, yet the whispers persisted, shifting from the door to the toilet, then to his ear. First, I saw it was coming from the door. Then it shifted to my toilet when I looked under my bunk as if someone was in my right ear. "You're not even close," the voice hissed, clear as glass. "You're not even close." Ethan's instincts, honed by lockup, screamed danger. Lockup had developed instincts in me that refused to let me go back to sleep. He pounded on the door, begging for a guard. I ran to the door and started pounding, calling for a guard. A guard stormed over, dismissing his pleas as paranoia. "What's the issue, inmate? You better be dying in there if you're slamming on the door like that." Ethan begged to move cells, but was rebuffed. "There's someone in here," I said through the door. "Can I move to another cell? I swear I'm not messing with you." The guard's laughter echoed as he walked away, leaving Ethan alone. All I heard were his boots dropping heavily down the hallway back to his office. The whispers stopped. The silence heavier than before. Then the whispers were gone. Exhausted, Ethan collapsed into sleep, chastising himself for his fear. Feeling foolish, I laid down and passed out, the fear having taken its toll on my body, and I was out like a light in seconds. But the box wasn't done with him. I was awake in the morning to a loud noise in my cell. Morning revealed chaos. His cell was trashed, papers torn, a message scrawled on his desk. All my property was strung about, toilet paper everywhere, and my locker door dented as if someone had kicked it repeatedly. The words, "See you later," glared from the desk, and one of my pens had been busted open with a message written on my desk saying, "See you later." Guards accused him of vandalism, striking him in anger. 3 guards were standing over me, looking more pissed than I'd ever seen them. "So, you think you can throw a temper tantrum on our watch? You little piece of crap," yelled the guard from last night. How had he slept through it? I cleaned up the mess and sat there with my head reeling. The truth emerged in the shower. A deep scratch marked Ethan's back. I turned, and in the reflection of the glass, I saw it, a large scratch mark running from my upper right shoulder to the middle of my spine. He collapsed, waking in the infirmary to a nurse berating the guard. I woke up in the infirmary. The nurse was demanding a confession from the guard. Ethan defended the guard, desperate to escape the cell. It was then I sat up. "He didn't do anything to me," I said as I shook, the fog from my head clearing. They moved him, and the whisperers never returned. "Can I move cells, sir?" "No problem. Just promise to act right from now on." Deal. That night changed him forever. That was my first paranormal experience ever, and it turned me into a believer. No explanation fit. Not guards, not inmates, not madness. To this day, I have never come up with an explanation for what happened. After his release, Ethan rebuilt his life, leaving crime behind. Since my release, I have never been arrested again. He found purpose in family and work, but the box's shadow lingered. I have a family now and 3 beautiful children, and I work 50 hours a week. Play with my kids every day and do my best to direct them on the right path. Ethan's new life was a shield, but the whispers haunted his dreams every quiet night. He braced for their return. He researched Lake Butler's history, finding tales of inmates who'd faced the box and left changed, or not at all. Old records hinted at a prisoner, decades dead, who'd sworn vengeance on the living, his voice carried by the walls. Was that the presence Ethan felt, or something older, hungrier? He installed locks on his home, checked them obsessively, and kept a knife by his bed. One night, he woke to a faint sound, like a voice on the wind. He searched the house, finding nothing but a chill that wouldn't leave. The box had marked him, and he feared it would follow him forever. He joined a group for ex-inmates, sharing his story to warn others. They spoke of similar encounters, whispers, scratches, cells that felt alive. The box wasn't just a place, it was a predator. Then came the night that broke his silence. A letter arrived, no sender, with a single phrase, "See you later." The handwriting matched the desk in his cell. Impossible, but real. He burned it, but the fear reignited a flame that wouldn't die. Was the box still watching, or had Ethan carried it with him? He told his wife everything, vowing to protect their children from the shadows of his past. But deep down, he knew the whisperers were waiting, ready to claim him again. Story number 10, Echoes of the Cell Block. You're alone in an old jail, the only guard on a silent night shift. The cells are locked, the inmates asleep, until a cold breeze brushes your neck and you realize you're not alone. What's watching you from the shadows of the control room? A trick of the mind? Or something darker? Something that knows your name? Doors unlock without a key. Footsteps echo where no one walks. And in the cell block, a figure moves, vanishing before you can scream. This isn't just a ghost story. It's a descent into a place where the past never dies, and the walls hold secrets that hunger for release. Every night, you wonder, will you see it again? Or worse, will it see you? The old jail was a relic, its crumbling walls a testament to decades of neglect. The jail in question was built in the 60s or 70s and was falling apart when I started working there. I was a rookie jailer, barely out of my teens, assigned to a facility with 3 cell blocks and a capacity for 60 inmates. It was a small jail with 3 housing blocks and held a max capacity of 60 inmates. My first weeks were spent shadowing a senior jailer, learning the ropes in a place where rules were loose and corners were cut. My first few weeks I was there, I was put with a senior jailer so they could show me the ropes. The standards for working in a detention facility at the time were fairly lax. Stories of hauntings floated among the staff, especially one about a jailer attacked by a shadowy figure in the control booth. Before I started the night shift portion of my training, I had several employees tell me the story of a jailer who was attacked by something in the booth, the control room where we are stationed. I laughed it off, chalking it up to rookie hazing. I didn't believe this story one bit and brushed it off as a trick they play on the rookies. But laughter fades fast in a place like this. The booth, a cramped room overlooking the cell blocks, was my post during night shifts. Once my training was complete, I was placed on night shift by myself. After weeks alone, I grew comfortable, even playing cards with inmates after lockdown. After several weeks of working on my own, I became comfortable being the only one on duty in the jail. I was even to the point where I would play checkers or cards with inmates if they were awake after lockdown. When the jail went quiet, I'd retreat to the booth, lock the heavy door, and watch an old TV. Once everyone was asleep in their cells, and I had done my watch tours, I would go to the booth, shut the heavy metal door, and turn on the old TV we had. Exhausted from part-time college, I'd sometimes nap, setting an alarm for hourly checks, a habit no one questioned. I was going to college part-time during the day. So, if it had been slow and no one had caused any problems, I would set my alarm on my phone for the next hour and take a nap, which was surprisingly accepted behavior in that jail as long as you did your hourly checks. One night, after my rounds, I dozed off in the booth, the control panel's green lights confirming all doors were locked. I did my checked the control panel to make sure all the doors were secured and locked, and then dozed off, as I had done many times before. A frantic noise woke me, an inmate worker banging on the booth's plexiglass. This time, I awoke to my inmate worker who had stayed up late to finish his laundry. He shouted about screams in a cell block. The trustee told me that they had heard screaming in one of the blocks. I bolted to the blocks, my flashlight sweeping the cells, and froze. Every door was wide open. I ran to each cell block and was alarmed to find every door had been unlocked. The inmates were asleep, unharmed, but the control panel later showed the doors had been manually unlocked. I shined my light in each cell and confirmed everyone was asleep and where they were supposed to be, and quietly locked the doors. Upon looking at the control panel, every door in the cell blocks had been unlocked manually. How could this happen? This was obviously a strange experience. But as I said, it was an old jail, and the control panel had seen better days. I chalked it up to an electrical malfunction and the scream the trustees heard as an overactive imagination. Morning came, and the inmates seemed oblivious to the night's events. Morning came, and all of the inmates had emerged from their cells to get breakfast. None of them appeared to be injured or complained of anything happening in the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Months passed quietly until one night when my trustee sat with me in the booth sipping coffee. My trustee was sitting on the steps of the booth, keeping me company as we drank our coffee. A flicker of movement caught my eye through the booth window, a figure in an orange jumpsuit pacing the cell block. As I was finishing my paperwork, I caught a glimpse of someone walking around in one of the cell blocks through the booth window. The control panel showed all doors locked. I looked out the control panel to find that every door was still locked and secured. I stared again, seeing a short, brown-haired man with a beard, head down, circling the block. I looked back through the window and saw a short, brown-haired man with a short brown beard wearing an orange inmate uniform, slowly walking around the block with his head down. He vanished behind a pillar. He made the second lap and walked behind a pillar, then didn't appear again on the other side. He was gone. But where? I stormed into the block, flashlight in hand, ready to confront him. I popped the block door from the control panel, exited the booth, and then stormed into the block, ready to chew this guy out. But the block was empty, no trace of anyone. But when I entered, there was no one there. I walked around the block, shined my light in every cell, and checked every door, checked in the showers, and under every table. Every door was secure, and no one was out of their cell. My trustee, pale, confirmed he'd seen the man too. I looked at my trustee and could tell he was just as confused as I was, and he told me he saw the guy too. At breakfast, no inmate matched the description. At breakfast, I looked at each inmate as they walked up to me to see if the one I'd seen in the cell block was among them, but no one came close to matching the description. A veteran dispatcher who'd worked there for decades listened to my story and nodded knowingly. That morning, I brought it up to one of the dispatchers who had worked there for 20 years. I described to her the man I saw. She pointed to a calendar and said, "That's him." Without a word, she pulled out the calendar, pointed to the date, and said, "Yep, that's him, surely." The man I'd seen matched an inmate who'd taken his life in that block years ago. She said the description of the man I saw matched that of a man who had hung himself in that cell block several years back. Moa, a repeat offender, once a model trustee. He changed during his final stay, becoming volatile and erratic. She said he was a repeat customer, as we like to call repeat offenders, and was always hired as a trustee due to his work ethic and good behavior. She said the last time he was brought in, he was a different man, fighting with the jailers and other inmates, talking out of his head and acting absolutely insane. One night, he'd used a sheet to end his life. She went on to say that one night the man took a sheet, wrapped one end around the door at the food slot and the other end around his neck, then leaned forward, causing him to asphyxiate and his life to end. His spirit, she claimed, haunted the jail. The dispatcher claimed the spirit of the man was the one haunting the jail and the one who had attacked the jailer several years back. I didn't want to believe her, but I did. I began to believe in the haunting after that. The jail never felt the same. Chairs spun on their own in empty rooms. As time passed, I experienced several odd occurrences, including office chairs spinning on their own. Shadows flickered across walls where no light should be, and shadows moving across the walls. Inmates reported an orange-clad figure passing their cells at night. Inmates would sometimes report seeing someone in orange walking past their cells in the middle of the night. Some woke to a third presence in their two-man cells, watching them sleep. And a select unfortunate few said they awoke to a third inmate in their two-man cell watching them as they slept. What was this thing? I met the jailer who'd been attacked. He'd quit soon after, his face darkening at any mention of it. I later met and befriended the guy who had been attacked by the entity. Shortly after the incident, he quit the jail and went to work for another police department in the county. He refused to talk about the incident, but would say that it was not a joke. Every night became a test of nerve. The booth's window showed fleeting glimpses of faces that vanished when I looked closer, catching a glimpse of someone looking through the booth window when no one was out. One night, a cell door creaked open during my rounds. Though the panel showed it locked, I found a torn sheet twisted into a noose lying on the floor. Was it a message? The inmates whispered about the third man, a ghost who walked the blocks, his footsteps echoing in the silence. I started avoiding the booth after dark, staying in the booking room where the lights were brighter. The jail's history weighed heavier with each shift. I learned of other deaths, fights, overdoses, suicides, all leaving their mark. Did they all linger here? The dispatcher shared stories of radios crackling with voices when unplugged, and lights flickering in patterns. My final night, I saw him again. The brown-haired man standing at the end of a block, staring at me. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched until I turned away. When I looked back, he was gone. I left the jail soon after, transferring to patrol, but the memories followed. Some places hold on to their pain, and this one never let go. Story number 11, the card game conspiracy. The air in the prison rec yard was thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. During a stint inside, one of the wildest fights I witnessed started over a game of cards. The concrete walls seemed to pulse with the weight of unspoken grudges, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast jagged shadows across the faces of the inmates gathered around a rusted metal table. This wasn't just a game. It was a battle for power, a twisted ritual where pride was the real currency. In this hellhole, where trust was rarer than a decent meal, a single wrong move could spark chaos, and tonight, chaos was coming. The cards slapped against the table, each flip a dare, each glance a challenge. The stakes weren't cash, obviously, but high enough to matter in there. Canteen items like chips, soda, chocolate bars, ramen, the usual prison currency. But to the men playing, those items were more than snacks. They were status, survival, a fleeting taste of freedom. A new inmate, Silas, sat at the table, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. He was lean, with a scar snaking down his neck, and he played with a quiet intensity that made the others uneasy. Opposite him was Gideon, a hulking figure with knuckles like hammerheads, and Marcus, whose sharp tongue could cut deeper than any blade. The game was spades, but it might as well have been war. Silas's hands moved too fast, his cards vanishing under the table for just a second. One guy called Nero got accused of cheating. He denied it, but things got heated fast. Except tonight, it was Silas in the hot seat. And Gideon's voice boomed across the yard, accusing him of palming an ace. Silas smirked, his defiance like gasoline on a fire. The other inmates leaned in, their breaths heavy, waiting for blood. Marcus slammed his fist on the table, demanding Silas show his hand. The air crackled with the promise of violence, and every eye was locked on the scarred newcomer. The truth hit like a gunshot. Eventually, the other inmates at the table forced him to show his hand, and yeah, he was cheating. Silas's cards revealed a hidden king, tucked beneath his sleeve. You could feel the mood shift in the air. The yard went silent, save for the low hum of the lights overhead. Gideon stood, his shadow swallowing Silas whole, while Marcus cracked his knuckles with a grin that promised pain. The two other guys, Tiberius and Caligula, told Nero to come back to their cell block with them just to talk it out. But tonight, it was Gideon and Marcus dragging Silas toward the shadowed corridor leading to Block D. Somehow, Nero agreed. Big mistake. The scream that followed was inhuman, a sound that clawed at your soul. Not 5 minutes later, all hell broke loose. The corridor erupted into a storm of fists and fury. All three of them came stumbling out of the cell, fists flying like a hurricane. Silas was no match for Gideon's raw power or Marcus's calculated cruelty. Gideon wielded a makeshift weapon, a jagged piece of metal torn from a bunk frame. Tiberius had a radio about the size of a fist and smashed it into Nero's head hard. The metal bit into Silas's scalp, blood spraying like a burst pipe. It cracked apart on impact, and what was left turned into a jagged weapon. The fight spilled back into the yard, a brutal dance under the flickering lights. They used the broken plastic and metal like a shiv, grinding it into the side of Nero's skull. Silas staggered, his face a mask of red, but he fought back with a ferocity that stunned the onlookers. Marcus laughed, a chilling sound, as he drove his boot into Silas's ribs. I swear you could see the bone. Blood was everywhere, slick and dark on the floor like oil. The other inmates watched, some cheering, others frozen, as the yard became a slaughterhouse. Then the alarms blared, sharp and relentless. That's when the goon squad stormed in, riot gear, tasers, and pepper spray ready. The guards moved like a machine, their boots pounding the concrete. By then, Nero was already crumpled on the ground and barely moving. Silas lay in a pool of his own blood, his chest heaving weakly. Tiberius went down easy after getting a face full of spray. Gideon took a blast of pepper spray and dropped to his knees, choking, but Marcus was a beast, shrugging off the first taser hit like it was nothing. But Caligula, the dude was massive. Six never missed a day at rec. Marcus charged the guards, his eyes wild with defiance. He decided to play tough and charged the officers, which was a bad move as they lit him up with the taser. But even then, he didn't go down right away. He roared, tearing at the riot shields, his strength unnatural. The second taser hit sent him crashing to the ground, his body twitching like a broken marionette. They hit him again, and that second jolt finally had him drop. The yard fell silent, the only sound the crackle of the guards' radios. Nero got taken out on a stretcher, barely conscious, his face barely recognizable. The aftermath was a suffocating weight. Because of the overcrowding at the time, they couldn't relocate us during the investigation. The prison went into lockdown, the air thick with fear and resentment. So, we were locked in ourselves around the clock, meaning meals brought to us zero movement, except for the legally required 1 hour a day in a tiny, grim courtyard. The bloodstains on the concrete didn't fade for weeks, a grim reminder of the cost of betrayal. Inmates whispered about Silas. Some said he died in the infirmary. Others claimed he was transferred to a max security facility, his face scarred beyond recognition. But the real terror wasn't the fight. It was what came after. No one said a word for days. You could still see the blood stains drying on the floor. Rumors spread that the cards themselves were cursed, that every game played at that table ended in violence. Inmates avoided it, leaving it empty under the flickering lights. One night, I swore I saw Silas's shadow linger there, his scarred neck glinting in the dark. No one said a word for days, and I never saw any of the three again. The prison never felt the same. Every shuffle of cards echoed like a warning. Every glance a potential spark. Inmates stopped playing spades, trading the game for dice or checkers, anything to avoid the table's curse. I wonder what happened to the guy. Did he die? The question haunted me, but the truth was worse. No one cared enough to find out. Silas, Gideon, Marcus. They were ghosts now, swallowed by the system. I don't know if I'd want to live with my face and body mutilated in the way he would have to be. And yet, the table still stood, waiting for its next players. The fluorescent lights ghost overhead, casting their sickly glow. Some said the bloodstains weren't just stains. They were a mark, a claim. The prison had its own rules, its own hunger. And in the dead of night, when the guards weren't watching, you could almost hear the cards whispering, daring someone new to sit down and play. Story number 12, The Phantom of Cell. The air in the prison's solitary wing was always heavy, like it clung to your skin, refusing to let go. I'd been a guard here for years, patrolling the dim corridors where the walls seemed to whisper secrets. My boots echoed against the concrete, the only sound in this tomb of a place at the beginning of my shift. I would do a security check and count inmates, but tonight, something felt wrong. The roster listed 28 prisoners, but my gut told me there was one more, a presence that didn't belong. I stopped at cell 13, its rusted door barely lit by the flickering bulb overhead. There was a gentleman in this cell next to my office with no paperwork. His silhouette stood motionless, his face obscured in shadow. I blinked, and my breath caught. His eyes seemed to glow faintly, like embers in a dying fire. I radioed the count room officer, my voice unsteady. "No one should be in that cell," he replied. My heart pounded as I approached the bars, but the figure didn't move. Who was he? And why was he watching me? The moment I reached for my keys, the cell was empty. I went back to the cell, but now there's no one there. My flashlight swept the corners, nothing but dust and peeling paint. A chill crawled up my spine, not from the cold, but from the certainty that I hadn't imagined him. The prison logs were clear. Cell 13 had been vacant for months. Was this a trick of the mind, or had I just seen something that wasn't human? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked the cameras, the logs, even the maintenance records. Nothing explained the man in cell 13. Turns out, me and several other people have had the phantom inmate happen to us. Guards whispered about a prisoner who died here decades ago, his name erased from the records. They said he lingered, bound to the prison by a debt he could never pay. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the weight of his gaze stayed with me. By the third night, I dreaded my rounds. The corridor to cell 13 felt longer, the shadows deeper. I swore I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate, matching my own. I spun around. Nothing. Then a faint scratch came from inside cell 13 like nails on metal. My hand trembled as I aimed my flashlight. Maybe he just wasn't done doing his time. Was he waiting for me to open that door, or was he already out, walking among us? The prison was a labyrinth of forgotten souls, and cell 13 was its heart. I started noticing things. Doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering only in that wing, and a faint smell of ash that no one could explain. One night, I found a scrap of paper wedged in the cell's lock, covered in scrawled numbers. My colleague, Jenkins, said he'd seen the phantom too, a tall man in a tattered uniform, his face half hidden, always standing in the same spot. We never spoke his name, but we both knew he wasn't just a memory. The prison's history was murky, but rumors spoke of a man who'd been locked away unjustly. His life ended in that very cell. His anger, they said, had seeped into the walls. I began to piece together the phantom story. Old guards shared tales of unexplained lockdowns, radios spitting static when no one was transmitting, and shadows that moved against the light. Jenkins found an archive box in storage, its contents brittle and yellowed. Inside was a single photo, a prisoner, his eyes head hollow, staring straight at the camera. The back read, "Cell 30, no name, no crime." When I showed it to Jenkins, he dropped his coffee mug, his face pale. "There's him," he whispered. Who he was or why he was there, I'll never know, but I knew he wasn't gone. Not really. The final night I saw him, the prison was under a blood-red moon. I was alone, the other guards off shift. Cell 13's door was ajar, though I'd locked it myself, inside. The air was thick, like breathing through wet cloth. I saw him again, taller this time, his form sharper, his eyes burning into mine. Maybe another person that took their life and simply can't move on. I didn't run. I couldn't. He stepped closer and I felt his voice, not in my ears, but in my bones. "You see me now." Then he was gone, and the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty wing. I quit the next day. Some debts, I learned, can never be paid. Story number 13, The Warden's Gambit. Imagine a place where the air itself feels like a blade against your skin, where every shadow hides a threat, and the ones meant to protect you are the architects of chaos. In the juvenile detention center, a concrete fortress of despair, the walls seemed to pulse with secrets. The psychiatric unit was a labyrinth of 24 cells, split across 2 floors, each door a steel barrier that locked away hope every night. The guards, towering figures in starched uniforms, patrolled with twice the numbers but half the compassion. This was no place for redemption, only survival. And on one fateful morning, survival turned into something far darker. The rumor hit like a spark in a powder keg. A new inmate was coming, someone whose crimes were whispered to be unspeakable. The guards didn't just deliver the news, they weaponized it. One of them, a man with a voice like gravel and eyes that gleamed with malice, stalked from cell to cell. He went cell to cell, pounding on the doors, killing us up. Your new inmate committed SA on 2 minors. They were 2 and 4 years old, his own cousins. He repeated it, each word a hammer strike, stoking rage in hearts already raw from confinement. The air grew heavy, charged with the promise of violence. The boy arrived at dusk, a scrawny, skinny-year-old with eyes that darted like a trapped animal's. They made him stand in the common room while the guards left. No handcuffs, no escort, just a lamb in a den of wolves. The silence that followed was deafening, a prelude to the storm. Then, with a mechanical groan, every cell door unlocked simultaneously. It wasn't an accident. It was a signal. The first to move was a kid from the upper tier, a wiry figure with a manic grin. My neighbor, a wire, unhinged kid that vaulted from the second level and drop-kicked the new guy like something out of a martial arts film. The impact echoed through the room, a sickening thud that unleashed pandemonium. Then the rest followed. 16 of us, a storm of fists and fury. The common room became a battlefield, bodies colliding in a frenzy of rage. Fists flew, boots stomped, and the new kid vanished beneath a tide of vengeance. The guards watched from the shadows, their radios silent, their faces unreadable. When they finally intervened, it was with calculated delay. The guards didn't intervene for at least a full minute. And when they did, they fired beanbags and dragged bodies apart. The floor was slick with blood, the air thick with the coppery scent of violence. The new kid was unidentifiable, broken bones, internal bleeding, torn skin, a mess of blood on the floor. He was a ruin, a testament to the guards' twisted orchestration. They dragged him to the infirmary, then shipped him to a hospital. But the story didn't end there. The boy's fate was sealed long before he arrived. In the hospital, whispers spread like wildfire. His injuries had worsened, but not from the initial attack alone. Someone, maybe another inmate, maybe someone on the outside, had slipped through the cracks of security. We heard through the grapevine that his injuries had worsened while in the hospital, and someone had gotten to him again, bit his throat open, mutilated his face, and he died in a hospital bed not long after arrival. The truth was a ghost, fleeting and untouchable, but the weight of it lingered. The guards had set the stage, but we had played our parts, willingly or not. The days that followed were a blur of lockdowns and interrogations, but no one spoke the truth. The guards closed ranks, their reports painting the incident as a spontaneous riot. But we knew better. The psychiatric unit was their chessboard, and we were the pawns every night. As the cell doors locked, I replayed this day, the moment the doors opened, the surge of bodies, the boy's broken form. I don't know what's more disturbing, the violence, the guards orchestrating it, or how quickly we all became a part of it. It wasn't just about the new kid's crimes, real or fabricated. It was about power, about how easily it could be wielded to turn boys into beasts. Life in the unit didn't change. The guards still patrolled. their boots echoing like a metronome of dread. But something inside us had shifted. We were no longer just inmates. We were accomplices in a game we didn't fully understand. The boy's name faded, but his ghost haunted the common room. Some said he deserved it. Others said we were all victims of the same machine. I wondered about the guard with the gravel voice, the one who'd lit the fuse. Was he proud of what he'd done, or did he lie awake at night, haunted by the blood on his hands? The detention center was a microcosm of a crueler world, where justice was a myth and survival demanded a piece of your soul. Years later, I walked out of those gates, but part of me stayed behind, trapped in that moment when the doors unlocked. The warden's gambit wasn't just a single act of violence, it was a lesson. It taught me how thin the line is between man and monster, and how easily it can be crossed when someone else holds the key. Story number 14, The Phantom Procession. It begins with a pulse, not a sound, but a force that grips your bones. The air grows thick, heavy, with an unseen weight, as if the night itself is holding its breath. You're alone, or so you thought, until the shadows start to move. They don't creep or slink, they march, deliberate and unyielding, through a world that should be empty. And then you see them, figures that shouldn't exist, passing through steel and flesh like smoke through a screen. The question isn't what they are. It's why they're here, and why they're looking at you on a desolate hill overlooking a rural prison. My dad used to work as a corrections officer, a solitary job that kept him circling the jail's perimeter in a battered truck. He drove the perimeter, which means he made circles around the jail in a truck, checking empty buildings for runaway inmates. Most nights, the monotony was broken only by the hum of the engine or the occasional rustle of wildlife. But this night was different. The stars seemed dimmer, the air colder, and a strange rhythm pulsed through the earth, like a heartbeat from somewhere deep below. Something was wrong. The dashboard lights flickered, not enough to die, but enough to make him pause. He starts to feel a thumping in his body, a sensation that wasn't sound but pressure, like standing too close to a speaker, blasting bass so deep it rattles your ribs. He described it as the feeling you get when you hear speakers playing a song with a really heavy bass and you can feel it through your whole body. He set his magazine aside, his pulse quickening. The truck felt smaller, the darkness outside larger. He glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting nothing but the empty hill. He was wrong. A shadow moved. Not a deer, not a stray inmate, a figure, tall and deliberate, standing just beyond the truck's tailgate. He puts the magazine down and checks his rear view and sees someone outside the truck. Instinct kicked in. He grabs his pistol out of the truck, weapon drawn, stepping into the cold night with his breath clouding the air. But the figure wasn't alone. A line of silhouettes stretched across the hill, moving in eerie unison. They weren't running or hiding. They were marching, their steps silent but heavy, as if the ground itself bore their weight. They weren't human, not anymore. When he gets outside, he sees a procession of Native Americans walking through the truck and directly through his seat. Their forms translucent yet vivid. He said it was clear they were ghosts because many of them appeared injured, some with wounds that glistened in the moonlight, others with limbs bent at unnatural angles. They didn't acknowledge him. Their eyes, hollow and distant, were fixed on some unseen destination, only to disappear at the exact spot he was sitting. The air that thrummed with that same relentless pulse, growing stronger with each figure that passed through. The procession wasn't random. These were warriors, elders, women, children, an entire community bound by some ancient purpose. Their clothing, a mix of traditional hides and tattered cloth, spoke of a time long before the prison was built. As they moved, the hills seemed to shift, the prison fading into a vision of open plains and starlit skies. He stood frozen, the pistol useless in his hand, watching as the last of them vanished. This went on for a few seconds, and then the whole procession vanished. The pulse stopped. The night was still again, but it felt wrong, like a wound left unhealed. He stumbled back to the truck, his mind racing at all. He called the other perimeter guy on his walkie to try and explain. Static crackled, then silence. The other guy immediately stopped communicating. Later, he learned why. Turns out the guy had seen it before, but he didn't believe in ghosts, so he didn't want to talk about it. But my dad couldn't let it go. He started digging, asking questions. The prison, he found, was built on land once sacred to a local tribe, a place of rituals and burials, raised to make way for concrete and steel. The ghosts weren't just passing through. They were reclaiming night after night. He felt that pulse again, fainter but persistent, like a warning. He began to see them in glimpses, a child's handprint on the truck's window, a shadow that lingered too long in the empty cells. The prison wasn't theirs anymore. It never had been. Each night, he drove the perimeter, knowing they were watching, waiting for the day the land would be theirs again. And every night, he wondered if he was part of their story or their judgment. The land held secrets deeper than the prison's foundations. Whispers among the older guards spoke of artifacts, arrowheads, beads, bones, unearthed during construction and discarded without ceremony. My dad started noticing things he hadn't before. The way the wind seemed to carry voices, faint and unintelligible, or how the perimeter lights dimmed at the same spot every night. He was being watched, not with malice, but with a weight that made his skin crawl. The procession wasn't a one-time event. It was a ritual, eternal and unbroken, tied to the earth itself. Something was waking. He began to dream of the procession, their faces clearer each time. A warrior with a scarred chest, an elder with eyes like polished obsidian, a girl clutching a woven doll. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, yet their meaning was clear. This is not your place. The dreams bled into his waking hours. He'd catch himself humming a melody he'd never heard or tracing symbols in the dust that he couldn't explain. The other guards noticed his change, his silences, the way he stared at the hill as if expecting it to move. One night, he parked at the hill again, deliberately. He wanted answers. The pulse returned, stronger, shaking the truck's frame. This time, they didn't just pass through. The procession stopped, their forms solidifying in the moonlight. The warrior stepped forward, his presence like a storm held in check. He pointed to the ground, then to my dad's chest. The message was clear. You carry this now. The pistol fell from his hand, useless. The ghosts didn't vanish. They waited, their eyes boring into him until he nodded, accepting a burden he didn't understand. He quit the job soon after. The prison didn't feel like a workplace anymore. It was a grave, and he was an intruder. Years later, he learned the tribe had been massacred centuries ago. Their bodies left unburied on that very hill. The prison's records showed unexplained incidents, lights failing, doors locking on their own, guards quitting after a single shift. The land remembered my dad never returned, but he carried the pulse with him, a rhythm in his bones that never faded to. And sometimes, in the quiet of night, he still hears their steps. Story number 15, The Price of a Word. There was this guy in my dorm room. He was quiet and mostly kept to himself. His name was Caleb, a wiry man with hollow eyes and a past he never shared. He drifted through the prison like a ghost, unnoticed, until the day everything changed. The air in the yard that day was thick with tension, the kind you feel when something's about to break. Inmates lounged against the chain-link fence, their laughter masking the unease. Caleb, though, stood alone, staring at the horizon as if he could will himself beyond the barbed wire. He was from my hometown, though I didn't really know him very well. But in a place like this, where trust is a currency no one can afford, that small connection felt like a lifeline. No one saw it coming, not even those who claimed to know him best. Caleb was a man of few words, his silence a shield against the chaos of prison life. He had just 4 months left on his sentence, practically out the door. Freedom was so close he could taste it, a dream that kept him steady. But dreams are fragile here, and a single moment can shatter them. That afternoon, the yard buzzed with the usual noise, shouts, footsteps, the clank of metal gate, ding, until a new voice cut through, sharp and venomous. A new inmate, Marcus, had arrived, his swagger announcing trouble before he even opened his mouth. He sized Caleb up, saw the quiet man as an easy target, and let a single word slip, a slur, a spark in a powder keg. The word hung in the air, a challenge no one could ignore. Prison rule number 1, never let anyone punk you out, especially in front of witnesses. In this world, respect is everything, and losing it is a death sentence. Caleb's face didn't change, but his eyes darkened, a storm brewing beneath the calm. The other inmates watched, their silence louder than any cheer. Marcus smirked, thinking he'd won without a fight. But Caleb wasn't the type to let things slide. So they met in the bathroom to square up, straight hands. It was supposed to be a quick scuffle, a way to settle the score. Marcus was bigger, faster, and he dropped Caleb in under a minute, leaving him bruised on the cold tile. The crowd dispersed, thinking the matter closed, but they were wrong. Thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Caleb retreated to his bunk, his silence heavier now, like a weight pressing down on everyone. He didn't rage or curse. He just sat there, staring at the wall, his mind turning over something dark. The hometown guy went quiet afterwards, didn't mouth off, didn't complain, just disappeared into his head for a few hours, and then he snapped. No one knew what he was planning, not even his bunk mate, who later swore Caleb had seemed fine. But inside, something had broken. He moved with purpose now, his hands steady, as he pried open a can of tuna from his stash. He opened a can of food in his dorm, maybe beans, maybe tuna, who knows, and folded the jagged lid in half until it was crude and serrated, concealed it in his hand. It was a weapon born of desperation, its edges gleaming with intent. The next time Caleb saw Marcus, he was ready. He walked right up to him like he was trying to make peace. The yard was crowded, the guards distracted, and no one noticed the glint in Caleb's hand. He said something like, "Good fight. You got me? Let's break bread." His voice was calm, almost friendly, and Marcus, caught off guard, extended his hand. He reached out his hand, and when the guy took it, he pulled him close and started hacking. The attack was swift, brutal, a blur of motion that left everyone frozen. People said he went for the neck first, caught the carotid with the edge of the can lid, and blood exploded across the floor. Marcus staggered, his hands clawing at his throat, his eyes wide with shock. The yard erupted into chaos. Inmates shouting, guards sprinting, but Caleb didn't run. He stood there, the bloody lid still in his hand, watching Marcus fall. The aftermath was a nightmare. Marcus collapsed, his blood pooling on the concrete, his breaths shallow and ragged. Inmates were herded back to their cells, the lockdown immediate and suffocating. They called the med team and the cops, but it was pure chaos. The prison went silent, the kind of silence that screams louder than any riot. Hours later, when they finally let us back into the common area, the blood was still there, a stark reminder of what had happened. The guards don't clean it. They left us to do it, mop and a bucket. We scrubbed in silence, each swipe of the mop a reminder of how fragile life was here, and the knowledge that we were standing where someone almost bled out over a word. Marcus survived, barely. After days in the infirmary, Caleb, though, was gone, dragged to solitary, his freedom a distant memory. They hit the hometown guy with attempted murder and threw him straight into solitary. His sentence stretched into years, all because of a single word. But the story didn't end there. The prison changed after that day, the air heavier, the inmates warier. Caleb's name became a whisper, a cautionary tale passed between bunks. Some said he'd been pushed too far, others that he'd always been a ticket bomb. The truth, though, was messier, all over a single word. That's what it takes here, I guess. In a place where words are weapons, one syllable can draw blood. The guards tightened their patrols, the rules grew stricter, but nothing could erase the stain of that moment. And as I mopped that floor, I couldn't shake the thought, how many more words would it take to break us all? Story number 6, The Sparrow's Revenge. You're a guard in a prison where the air hums with unspoken rules. Every glance a warning. A new kid steps into the yard, unaware he's crossing a line that could cost him everything. I used to work as a corrections officer at a prison in Raven Hall, just outside of Melbourne, a facility where the population was split hard along racial and cultural lines. He smiles, plays ball with the wrong crew, and the yard goes silent, like a storm's brewing. Pacific Islanders, Muslims, Asians, and white inmates, each stuck to their own group. The next day, you find him tired, bleeding, a message carved into his flesh. The rules weren't written down, but everyone knew them, and everyone knew better than to cross them. What they did to him wasn't just punishment. It was a horror you can't unsee. One afternoon, a new inmate arrived. The kid's screams still echo, and you're not sure you'll ever forget. A young Asian guy, barely out of his teens. He was green, too young for Ravenhall's sharp edges. Still had the nervous energy of someone who didn't realize just how dangerous this place was. He wandered into the yard, all smiles, joining a game with the Islanders. On his first full day in the yard, he walked over to the basketball court, enjoyed a game with the Islanders. You watched, feeling the tension ripple. Just like that, he smiled, tried to joke, even passed the ball a few times. Eyes followed him, his own groups, cold and unforgiving. The Islanders didn't react much, but the other Asian inmates were watching. The yard held its breath, the code shattered. The rest of us saw it, too. You knew it was coming, but not like this. You could feel the atmosphere shift, the unspoken code that had now been severed, and everyone there knew there would be consequences. You walked the yard the next day, the quiet too heavy, like a lie. You don't make friends with the wrong crew and expect your own to let it slide. Then you saw him, upside down, strung from the hoop, blood dripping. I came on shift and headed out into the yard as the inmates were returning from domestic duties. His uniform was shredded, his body slashed with precision. Gardening, laundry, waste management. You froze, bile rising, the air thick with cruelty. It was quiet, the way it gets when everyone's pretending nothing happened. You called for help, cutting him down, his pain a weight you couldn't shake. But I passed the court and stopped dead. They didn't just hurt him, they marked him, inside and out. The kid, that same new guy, was hanging upside down from the basketball hoop. His skin was a canvas of shallow cuts, meant to scar, not kill. His ankles were tied up with strips of his shredded uniform. He muttered about a stomachache, eyes glassy, refusing to break. His pants were gone, and his legs and backside were covered in dozens of razor-thin slashes. You got him to medical, but his words lingered. It looked like someone had used a box cutter or a smuggled razor blade. Later, a nurse called, her voice tight. Nothing deep enough to kill, just enough to humiliate and make him bleed. He'd whispered something under sedation, something impossible. I called for backup and started cutting him down, trying not to vomit from the smell. What they did defies reason, a cruelty that haunts you still. When we got him on a stretcher, he kept insisting he was fine and he just had stomachache. Scans revealed it, a sparrow, mutilated, lodged inside him. He said it was in the food. You couldn't fathom how or why. His voice shook, but he wouldn't say more. The inmates were silent, their eyes daring you to dig. Later that evening, a nurse from medical called me down. You saw their work before, animals tortured for sport. But this was new. A message carved in flesh and bone said the kid had finally whispered something under sedation. The kid was gone soon after, transferred for his safety, his silence a shield. I think they shoved a bird up my ass. No one talked, but the yard remembers. We thought it must have been delirious. You walked the block daily, feeling their stares, knowing they knew. But after 3 days in the medical wing, scans showed there was something lodged deep inside him, something organic, and they had to remove it in pieces. No report named names, no one would break the code. It was a sparrow, a dead one, jammed inside him. Headless with the wings torn off, beak and feet removed, you left Ravenhall eventually. But the kid's face stays with you. We never figured out how they managed to find it, let alone sneak it back into the unit or get it into him in the first place. The sparrow, the cuts, the silence. It was a warning, not just for him, but for you. The prisoners are resourceful, buggers, and there's no shortage of cruelty there. You couldn't stay after that. They used to kill time by torturing stray animals. The job was hard before, but this broke something in you. A sparrow wouldn't have stood a chance. You took a desk job, far from Ravenhall's walls. There was no official report on who did it. You told a friend, a former guard, expecting disbelief. No inmate would talk. He wasn't shocked. Ravenhall had stories, whispered in the break room. The kid was transferred out not long after, probably for his own safety. Inmates punished traitors with precision, leaving no trace. I still think about him sometimes, how quiet he was after. One spoke of a cat gutted and hidden in the cell, a message like the sparrow. You searched for the kid years later, hoping he was okay. You see a lot in this job, no trace. He'd vanished, likely on purpose. Fights, stabbings, overdoses. You found a forum for ex-guards, their tales mirroring yours. Cruelty as currency, codes unbreakable. But that was the most depraved thing I'd ever seen. One mentioned Ravenhall, a riot in the 90s. Bodies marked with cuts like his, not just through the brutality, the message it left behind. No proof, just echoes of the yard's law. Now, you're different, quieter, haunted. You avoid crowds, places that feel too closed. You dream of the hoop, the sparrow, his blood. You wrote about it anonymously on a blog for prison stories. Others replied, guards, inmates, families, all carrying Ravenhall's weight. You don't know who did it or why they chose a bird, but you know one thing: the yard never forgets, and neither do you.